This is Dr. Jack Schull, and I'm Lowell Sever, and we're going to talk about Jack's career in epidemiology and genetics, population genetics, and we'll go forward. Thank you for agreeing to do this, or I guess I should say thank you for agreeing to do it and inviting me to participate with you, but I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I hope you won't be disappointed.
But we've got our questions,
right.
And so let me just kind of go through those, and then we can chat or whatever. The first question is kind of relates to the decision to go into epidemiology, and says that few people really start out to be epidemiologists. And how did your path lead you into epidemiology?
Well, let me begin by saying I'm flattered, but greatly surprised to be identified with the senior portion of the epidemiological community. I have never really seen myself as an epidemiologist. I was trained in human genetics and in human population genetics in particular, but the techniques that we use are similar in many respects. The focus on populations and mechanisms that lead to change in those populations, so that I suppose in that sense I could be construed as an epidemiologist. Part of my selection of human genetics was, I suppose, serendipitous. I had started training in Drosophila genetics, but as I progressed further and further along that pathway, I became more and more interested in the human as object of study rather than the fruit fly. And when I went to graduate school, there were relatively few places in the United States, in fact you could count them on one hand, that could have trained an individual in human genetics. And of those places, perhaps the most well recognized was Ohio State University, because Lawrence Snyder and others were there. So I went to graduate school at Ohio State, and while there met people like Madge Macklin and so on, who were already into cancer epidemiology. And working with and near them was a great experience, you know, and began to lead me to see the similarities between our approaches. When I graduated, the human genetics had not become the cachet that it has recently, and the world was not beating a pathway to my door. So the job opportunities were limited. I could have gone into an academic position at McGill, or the other option was to go to Japan with Jim Neal to work on the follow-up program there. And I selected that.
The rest is history.
And the rest is history, that's right. And in so many ways, certainly not foreseen at that time, it has determined virtually everything that's happened to me since.
Well, it's interesting because, as you know, when we first talked about this, I said, well, I've never thought of you as an epidemiologist. I've always thought of you as certainly one of the preeminent people in population genetics. And but I think it's clearly appropriate to identify you as a member of the epidemiology community.
Well, you know, sort of formally, my first association was when I came to Texas, because epidemiology at Michigan was in the School of Public Health. We were in the medical school. There was interpersonal relationships, and fairly strong ones in many instances, but certainly we didn't have joint programs of research. It was more in teaching and in sort of consulting with one another that our relationships arose there.
Yeah. What would you say in terms of looking at epidemiology as a discipline over time, the biggest changes have been in the field?
Oh, I would, without hesitancy, say subject matter. Certainly when I was becoming acquainted with epidemiology, the focus was largely on infectious disease epidemiology. People hadn't really, as yet, centered their thoughts on chronic disease. Even diseases such as diabetes, which attracts much attention now, had relatively little interest to epidemiologists. Progress was being made but there was much to be done in the infectious disease sphere. And the full impact, I think, of the antibiotics that were developed during World War II and in the years subsequently had not yet spilled over into our perception of what goes on in human populations. I'm not sure that was all to the better. I think we're now seeing a resurgence of need for people in infectious disease epidemiology. And there certainly was a period of time when I suppose most individuals in our discipline would have thought that infectious disease was a historical tangent.
In terms of looking at your career, who would you say most strongly influenced you as a scientist, an epidemiologist, geneticist?
Well, I think without question it would have been Jim Neal. Jim and I worked together closely at Michigan for 20-odd years, and then somewhat more distantly after I came to Texas. But in so many ways, events that were seminal in my life were things that were initiated by Jim. And he was a consummate investigator, a person of enormous vitality and interesting ideas. So it was fun to work with Jim.
It's funny because I put you and Jim together kind of like Watson and Crick. It's Schull and Neal and Watson and Crick is very important dynamic duos, I guess, is one way to look at it.
Well, I think many have seen us that way. I've heard Damon and Pythias being the other comparison.
In terms of clearly the relationship that you had with Jim, collaboration has been a key part of your career. What do you think the most successful things are that support professional collaboration?
Well, I think openness, so that one's relationship to his collaborators is pretty much out on the table. I think a sense of fairness in sharing whatever credits may come from the research. I think a sensitivity, cultural sensitivity, and this is particularly true, it seems to me, when one's involved in international research, where you're moving across one, sometimes several different cultures with quite different expectations. And if there isn't a feeling that you at least are trying to understand the positions from whence they came, I think you'll have difficulty. I like to liken this to the collaborations I've had in Japan.
I was going to ask you about ABCC and RERF.
That's a very interesting story in so many respects. And perhaps the most interesting part comes not from the actual follow-up so much of the radiation exposure issues, as in some of the other population problems. We learned soon after that work had begun that this was a marvelous opportunity to study the consequences of inbreeding on human beings. And this was done under the aegis of the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, but separately from it. And here was a situation in which we were taking to the Japanese people a whole new notion, and the negotiations that went on, because this was going to involve bringing children from their homes who were 5 to 11 years old at the time, getting the school authorities to allow them to absent themselves formally from school for the day that they would be examined and the like. And the negotiations seemed to be interminable. I think you could have floated a battleship in the green tea that we drank. But once all of the T's had been crossed and the I's had been dotted, there was never another hitch. All of the time involved in working out the relationships was right up front. And we weren't accustomed to that, really. And we soon learned that once a contract, in effect, whether verbal or written, had been arranged, they would adhere to that contract to the letter of the understanding. Now, if a new one was negotiated, they might be a lot harder. They might have felt themselves that they'd sold themselves short in that initial round, and they would negotiate more strenuously, but they would never welch on it, and you would never see a situation in which halfway through the contract they want to rewrite it, as can happen so easily here. It was again just, I think, insight into how the Japanese culture was operated at that time. I think it's still true to a substantial extent, but perhaps not quite as much so as it was 40, 50 years ago.
But it was really understanding and accommodating your approach to the Japanese.
And you learned that while they didn't necessarily expect to have their position accepted, it was important that that position be heard. And so you would, when you were working with school-age children, you spoke to the PTAs, you spoke to the major educational authorities in the communities in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You spoke to the people at the individual schools. And as I say, this took a lot of time. It was never confrontational, but it was just that you had to make the necessary steps and the reporting. And it worked out marvelously after that. We never had a bit of a problem. I can not imagine, or at least I'm not aware of any other study that had the level of cooperation that we had, say, in the big study of inbreeding, which was from 1950 to 1960. At that time, we had identified about 6,300 individuals to be brought back and to be examined. About 2,100 were in Hiroshima and about 4,200 in Nagasaki. In Nagasaki, of those who are still residing in the city and therefore available to be examined, only 1/2% refused to be examined.
That's incredible.
It is really unbelievable. And the situation was not quite as good in Hiroshima, but it was still less than 1%. And this entailed considerable dislocation to the mother. She had to arrange to have someone stay at the house. She brought the child in and all the rest of it, but it was, the level of cooperation was just fantastic.
Well, I think it illustrates the importance of stakeholder involvement before the word stakeholder involvement was
very true,
was
very
set up.
Right,
I mean,
right.
it really is.
Yeah.
It's an incredible
Yeah.
opportunity to move things like that. Who would you say, kind of in looking at the field of epidemiology, would you consider to be a couple of the, say, the most influential people, at least from your perspective in the field?
This is the most difficult one to respond to, Lowell, and also the most loaded in the sense that there are so many people that I can think of who have made really significant contributions to epidemiology that it's only with risk to my scalp that I identify three.
Well, we can say that there's a longer list, but we need to just focus.
Very definitely. Of the three that come to mind, they're quite different individuals. All are now deceased, but the first one would be Thomas Francis. Tommy Francis his reputation as a scientist was established without question in his work on influenza. And he would have been assured of a prominent position in science for that reason, if no other reason. But there are three other contributions which are perhaps less well known in some instances that really were seminal. First of all, Tommy Francis was the spark that drove the evaluation and the design of the study that examined the Salk vaccine. And this was a huge undertaking, done at a time when we weren't yet accustomed to huge multi-institutional collaborations. Another one of considerable importance that he initiated was a community-wide public health surveillance system. And this was in Tecumseh, Michigan, which is a town of about 10,000. And I think the third would be his chairmanship of a small group that became known in time as the Francis Committee. It consisted of Tommy Francis, Felix Moore, and Seymour Jablon. And they went to Japan in 1955 at a time when the work of the commission had lost focus. It was drifting. And these three individuals, I suspect primarily at Tommy's instigation, recommended a series of changes which reversed the direction of the program almost totally and has nonetheless served the institution surprisingly well for 50 years. And to set out a program that can do that
It's pretty remarkable.
pretty remarkable,
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah, yeah.
I think the second person I found very impressive was Alexander Langmuir. Alex Langmuir is sometimes called the father of modern infectious disease epidemiology. That may be an oversell.
A little hyperbole, but
yeah, but he certainly would be a very prominent person in that sphere. And I think it was two things that always attracted me about him. His perspective on epidemiology. He certainly believed very strongly in the epidemiologist being a part of the problem that he was studying. He liked to use the word shoe leather epidemiology, that you went, you consulted, you interviewed, you saw the circumstances.
The IS model.
You were right there. And of course, that was the model that he imposed on the epidemiological intelligence system, which really is the beginning of the epidemiology program at CDC.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And that was a formidable contribution in itself. I think the third person, you'll forgive me for this perhaps, is Roel Stallons. Stoney's own contribution to field work was not great. He was involved in the Alameda County studies and a few things of that nature. But Stoney's importance to epidemiology seems to me to rest on his vision of education in epidemiology. The whole notion of the matrix, the flexibility that it offered students, and the opportunity to see a larger picture of epidemiology was profound.
Yes.
It's not been as widely accepted as I think it warrants, but nonetheless it certainly stimulated an enormous amount of self-inspection at the other schools of public health. The other attribute about Stoney that I always admired was the pithiness, the often acerbic quality of his comments on the way epidemiology behaves, or behaved, and his analysis of major programs. The Mr. Fit one, for example, is a classic illustration. And Stoney had this capacity to encapsulate really large issues in a surprisingly short statement. One of the ones that I always enjoyed was his assertion that arithmetic computations are merely an answer to an equation. They are not the solution to a problem. And I think we have forgotten that.
Yeah.
And there is perhaps too much obeisance to the role that statistics can play in epidemiology. But at any rate, those would be my three candidates. And as you can see, they're quite different reasons, but there would be many others. We've spoken about some of them on other occasions. Noel Weiss, Janet Dolling, Warren Winkelstein. Well, we know that Sir Richard Dahl, Zena Stein, and Merwin Susser, and George Comstar have already been interviewed for very obvious reasons. But there are many others that I hope will in time have an opportunity to spread their voices on this record.
It's an interesting selection, an interesting triad. And as we were saying before, I appreciated Stoney's view of epidemiology a long time ago, and continue to do so. Well, we've talked about other people. Now let's get back to you. And one of the questions has to do with your perception of some of your perhaps most influential papers, and some that you think may have been kind of slighted and made greater contributions than have been appreciated. So.
It's easier for me to address the latter than it is the former. I'm not really sure. I think my sense of the importance of some of the contributions have changed over time. And they've not always been epidemiologic. I think the thing that disturbs me the most is a publication which I believe never really received the recognition that it warrants. And that was a combination of reasons, probably the most important one being that at the time we chose perhaps an unwise mechanism for spreading the information on the record. And what I'm referring to is the report on the findings on pregnancy terminations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that was published in 1956 as a publication of the National Academy of Sciences. It was a monograph, sizable in terms of at least the number of words and the number of tables. But the Academy was probably not the best choice, even though it gave a certain cachet to it. But the fact was that the Academy's books are not publicized very much, although they set aside, I think, almost 2,000 volumes for free distribution. They were all distributed in a relatively short period of time, and others who were coming along, or as the field changed, the book was no longer available. And in most libraries, as you know, these monographic reports are often very difficult to find. Nobody seems to know how to catalog them or anything else,
Yes,
and
yeah,
there they are. The book was republished in the one that you have there called The Children of Atomic Bomb Survivors. But that probably didn't solve the problem either. It just brought it
out with a new cover.
Yeah, it brought it out with a new cover. And I
yeah.
think the reason that I feel that way is from my strict perspective, there were three things that we did there which are really quite novel for the time, at least in my view. One of them was the extensive use of multivariate analysis. Now, in 1956,
that was no small feat.
That was no small feat. These things all had to be done on a desktop calculator, and it was tedious as all get out. Clearly, the theory had been laid. I suppose you could start it with John Wishart's publication of the multivariate normal distribution. And certainly Hotelling and the others in the late 20s, early 30s had laid the theoretical groundwork. But there'd never been the computational capacity for that, and still wasn't in 1956. I know that I used to use as a rule of thumb, it was the cube of the rank of a matrix was the amount of time necessary to invert it. Now, you know, if you think of just a 5 by 5, you've got 2 hours to turn, and that's on the supposition that you don't make any errors.
It works the first time.
That's right.
Yeah.
You go 2 more variables to a 7 by 7, and now you're up to 6 hours almost. And it was not easily applicable. The other thing that we did at that time was looked at the use of variance component analysis in estimating, in this case, birth weights. And while variance components had been widely used in other spheres of biology, they hadn't been used in the human context at all. And I suppose the third one would be, given now that power calculations are the sine qua non, we were doing power calculations a half century ago when this wasn't the rule of thumb. And we still use it in a somewhat different way, and instead of viewing this as the justification for an experiment to begin, this was retrospective, and given a sample size, what kind of difference could one detect with reasonable precision? So those three things were all quite novel in 1956. But, you know, obviously by the time the book was republished in 1990, all of them had become a part of the standard armamentarium of every epidemiologist.
Interesting.
In large measure, I think because of new computational techniques, and obviously the computers that are now available that allow you to do so much without knowing what you're doing.
I think there's been a lot lost in that game.
I think so too. It's a very interesting issue, Lowell, because you know when you knew that the man hours that you were going to have to invest in the analysis of a particular set of data was going to be very large. You thought long and hard about what it was that you wanted to do and why you wanted to do it. And that included everything from making the basic tabulations that you were going to have to analyze from. Today, what we used to just call fishing expeditions are now called data mining and so on. They are pointless observations on data simply because you can run these things so rapidly.
Because the
data are there,
yeah,
and
yeah,
the programs are all there.
Yeah.
And I think we lose a lot by that strategy. Perhaps we gain some too.
Well, that leads into the question of the research questions that you've identified and have chosen to work with. I really, there's a broad array there. Is there kind of a guiding principle that you've used in terms of looking at what to look at?
Well, to a considerable extent, this obviously reflects my association with Jim Neal. Much of Jim's research can be ordered under the rubric of mutagenesis. He was interested in the occurrence of mutation spontaneously as well as a consequence of exposure to mutagenic agents, primarily ionizing radiation. By proximity, I guess, those became issues of considerable moment to me too, and much of it was guided by, on the one hand, trying to fill a huge gap in the data so that programs are set up both to look at the rates of spontaneous mutation as well as the issue relating to ionizing radiation in Japan. And then, of course, that automatically leads one into issues relating to the loss, the spread of mutant genes in populations, and so that brought in the whole business of inbreeding and all the rest of it, so that I guess I kind of stepped out of the mold only when I got involved in the genetic contribution of the adaptation to hypoxia. And that was not something I...
Oh, that wasn't one of Jim's issues.
No, that wasn't one of Jim's issues. Yeah. No, he was off in the jungles of Venezuela and Brazil at the time. When those studies began, Jim offered me the opportunity to be involved. But I had seen enough of the jungle during World War II that I wasn't...
You were not ready to go back.
Yeah, wasn't ready to go back.
Yeah. That was his early studies, the Yanomamo?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the Shivante first.
Oh, Shivante, that's right, yeah. Well, in looking at your career, what contributions to the field do you take the most pride in?
Actually, the studies in Japan, and I use this in the broadest sense. It's not just the genetic ones, but the teratogenic and the carcinogenic as well. I suppose it'd be fair to say that I'm one of the few that have been associated with those studies who've actually been involved in all three of those issues. Usually, Jim was focused solely on the genetic. Most of the other individuals that I know have focused primarily on the carcinogenic effects, since they have been, in terms of numbers of individuals affected, obviously the most significant. But the teratogenic may be some of the most interesting that have been found there. That is one of the areas that I take great pride in. And I am delighted by what we were able to do, particularly when you think that some of the critical observations were being made in the mid-1950s, when no one knew exactly how they would be used.
Right.